Welcome to the part of the program that everybody who's ever been in this debate remembers vividly or has nightmares about. Either one, take your pick. But we will now take questions from the panel. Who would like to start?
So I'll start by trying to set some common ground for me. I hope it'll be common ground for you. So I'm going to make an assumption. I'm going to tell a story here for about 30 seconds based on that assumption, and then I'm going to want each team to comment on anything you think I got wrong. So I take it, this is my assumption, that both of you think that the norm for my ballot should be the results that are achieved in terms of positively affecting the climate by each of the competing proposals. Now, if that's correct, that's my assumption, that you want results, okay, then it's a question of a three-part formula. A times B equals C, A being the amount of result that would be produced by compliant activity by an actor, times B, the number of actors that comply, and that equals C, the total amount of reduction that we get. So I would then think that I have to weigh, in judging each of the proposals, and this should be what disposes my ballot, what I think the weight of each of those A's is, and the number of A's there'll be in B. Do I have anything wrong? Do you want to give me different guidance for how I should vote? I'm asking that of both teams.
Well, we start with the affirmative.
Sorry, I'm a bit close, but so we would argue that, first of all, yes, absolutely, we're intent on evaluating the rounds based on the ends that occur, but secondly, a little important clarification, we have ends that occur inside or constructive outside of the realm of just the climate, and definitely that we're going to be going for in our final speech. Specifically, the last argument in our constructive explains why enforcement has intrinsic value, because when one international accord or treaty is enforced, that leads to an effect where other international law is respected. That's going to be really, really important. In fact, we're going to argue that is the most important issue when you write your ballot today, because the odds either of us solve climate change, pretty low. We're going to argue that we have a higher probability, but it's pretty low. The odds that we see a rights violation occurring in the next 5 or 10 years where a country violates their own citizens' rights or violates international law or sanctions in a poor manner, that's what happens when countries don't respect the rule of law. That's the most important impact in the round. That's the most probable, excuse me.
So just to ask a follow-up quickly, and then I'm going to try to keep quiet for the rest. So you're saying that you haven't introduced your strongest argument just yet. You've implied it. And it's going to be the argument that there are these collateral advantages that enhance the rule of law.
Yeah, we had the argument, we had the evidence, the card at the very bottom of our constructive.
No, I took notes, and I noted that you hadn't, but more to come, in other words.
Absolutely. We got a lot coming.
All that you've done up to now shouldn't determine my ballot, but you're going to add some other consequence.
Yeah, you bet.
Okay.
Negative. You'll answer, Dr.
So, first of all, thank you for the clarification. Maybe like 3 pieces of response. First of all, we believe that we agree that it's about like A times B, so participation and how many countries and how much they do, and that is to say.
Don't forget A prime.
Yeah, I'll get to it in third later. So, given that, we think that we might agree with Team Affirmative that compliance on their side is extremely strong because they simply have extremely sanctions. That's something we're fine with admitting. But because we were able to show you that sanctions actually deter a country from signing in the first place, means that the A part, or the B one, the A one is actually stronger on our side. That's the first one. And the second one, I would like to emphasize that we also talked in the first speech that given that the motion talks about climate change as such, we also think that media attention and how people perceive the agreement is also important, right? So when you think that the agreement is like bad and takes away your rights, this is the point when you will never vote for a good government. And also, third one, we just want to clarify that if an argument like the most important one comes in the last speech, which we cannot address, we just don't see how good it is in the context of the debate, because we cannot respond to it.
Next question. Okay.
Now you get a real expert.
For the affirmative, enforcement is desirable, but is it practical? I'm reminded that when Stalin was asked about the Pope, he said, "The Pope, how many divisions does he have?" How, in your mind, would an enforceable treaty be enforced?
So we would say at the end of the day, first of all, that like the enforcement mechanisms that would be put in place would be similar to most international accords, just be enforced by the preponderance of countries. Now, in the context of how often will that take action, as they point out, there's scenarios where that may not be as effective as possible. But what we would also contend is that when we put enforcement mechanisms in place, they also have a very expressive signal that's really important for like how people approach climate change agreements in the future. And we talk about this both in like our first speech and our second speech when we discuss how like when we talk about the discussion of participation and compliance, when everyone participates but no one complies, it creates a hollow hope, first of all. And second of all, when they talk about the idea of like media discourse, we would say a scenario where everyone seems less committed. That's a scenario where there's less respect for like environmental law in general. So we would say two things. First, that yes, enforcement will happen in some scenarios, but there will be some shortcomings. But second of all, we bridge the more fundamental gaps for why climate policy isn't pushed, which is like total respect for like the importance of climate law in general.
And for the negative, if you have a non-binding, in the sense of enforcement treaty, how would you envision encouraging or reaching high levels of compliance with that treaty?
So to clarify, we don't claim that we have a higher level of compliance than the affirmative does. This debate is structured in a way that they automatically gain more compliance just because they have stringent measures on their side, whereas we get more participation. What we are claiming is that we have sufficient compliance to keep most countries in the agreement and keep them to reach their goals. And what we are also claiming is that the A part, the participation, is much wider on our side. So even if all of those countries do not comply, the overall emissions reductions are much higher on our side because we achieve greater participation.
I would just quickly add to the point about compliance. We don't think that it's inherently already lost on our side, but to specifically address your question, we have international pressure and a domestic one, which works on our side as well. So that is to say, despite not having sanctions, we think that these two are sufficient for our side to win the debate. Thanks.
Next question. Okay, Mr. Lupo?
I'm trying to understand what, in the sort of vein of the A times B equals C, what compliance with what are we evaluating those multiples by? You've not talked about a specific treaty or standard or goal when you discussed the difference between compliance and non-compliance. Is there a norm that you think exists for either reduction target or behavior of a country that is considered compliant?
So in the status quo, we'd argue that the most widespread, critically acclaimed climate accord that exists in the negative world is going to be the Paris Accord. So within the Paris Accord, there is no objective. In fact, they have NDCs, so countries can set their own targets. There's no objective one standard that all countries must adhere to. We'd argue compliance has intrinsic value because it's not just about you getting to one number, but rather you getting to your number. When you sign on a piece of paper, you may be participating, but you are not complying. We look at the A times B scenario that Mr. Sexton brings up. Ane is the math guy in our team, but I know that when A equals 0 and you're multiplying by B, your answer is still 0 because it doesn't matter how much participation you have. When there's no compliance, compliance being when you meet the goals that you signed up to meet for, you're not getting any impact. That final number and that final value is 0.
Jean Paul? You want to direct it? Okay.
Yeah, and a quick question for the negative. I want to understand the value of participation absent compliance. It seems like you're making a concession, or you just made a concession earlier in cross-examination that the affirmative team would increase compliance, meaning there are lots of participants in your world who are not complying. What is the value of participation if you're admitting they're not actually reducing their emissions or meeting targets?
Yep. So, I would say that this debate comes up to one big clash, and that is it better to have, let's say, random number, 200 countries which do some kind of a job because they are compliant sufficiently, or when you have, let's say, 50 to 70 countries who are participating, but they're actually doing their stuff. With that in mind, we think that, yes, we have lower compliance. That is given by the motion. Simply, sanctions are strong compliant. That is something which we cannot argue against. But what we are claiming is that the compliance on our side is sufficient, but because the participation is so high, it is different. With that in mind, the intrinsic, the unique value of participation is exactly because of the media attention, is about how people perceive it, but also the fact that you can deal with more countries, you're able to get more goals, more concessions, more negotiations. Therefore, more countries is generally also a benefit in itself.
Thank you. Next
Can I
question,
add on that?
Mr. Baker?
I was going to ask a question to the bearer, but it got demoted down from the table to the floor. So I'm going to skip that for now and just kind of follow up where Mr. Lupo was, which is I'm not really totally with this explanation of the creation of compliance versus participation. I've invited a bunch of people over to my house to work, and when it's 20 or 30, they don't get much more done than 3. So I guess what I want to understand is, in the world where you have more participation and therefore get more concessions or more compliance or more adherence, is there any empirical example that you can point to in a non-binding context where that's actually happened, where we've had more people involved, and as a result, yippee, we've gotten more stuff done?
Okay, so this is a slightly different situation than people working on a house together, because here everyone
I'm
has
glad.
because here everyone has their own emission reduction targets to achieve. So every country is doing something on their own, and what we are doing is adding up the benefit from all those. So the value of having more participants is that even if not everyone does all of their job, we get more done in total. And to the empirical part, we believe that the Paris Agreement, while it is not perfect because we can see withdrawals, still achieved far more in terms of emission reductions than the Kyoto Protocol, which only had about 40 nations participating and had extremely low limits, which is again something that we achieve on our side because countries are not afraid they can set higher limits for themselves. So when we compare these two protocols, we can see that the Paris is far more successful.
Let me ask you a little bit of a follow-up related to that then. In that world, does that assume that the larger number of polluters, for example, if the top 10 were active, that's the same as the amount of pollution or control that would exist for the next 30 or so? Because there seems to be an implicit relationship between the level of involvement and how much they're contributing to the problem. I just want to understand how those things interact.
So thank you for your question. We would just like to point out the fact that basically what we are speaking is not just about numbers, not about just quantity of the states that are within the agreement, but especially about how much emissions do they produce. And what we are saying is that we have something exclusive that is basically participation of the United States and China, which on the other side of the house at this current point, it simply isn't the case.
And I just a quick question for the AF, which is, I'm going to go back to this enforcement question, because I think you all have given 5 answers to it, but I still don't have any idea how you all are actually enforcing anything. So let's try this again. I understand that you don't have to necessarily defend enforcement. I understand that you all feel that you're defending a shared resolution. Get all that, okay? But in the world that, let's say, JP and I were hanging out later on, we were trying to figure out, how would you actually enforce and add something? Can someone give us an answer to the question of how you would actually enforce it, like what a mechanism of that would be? I'm not changing your defense of the resolution, but want to understand what that practically looks like to understand how it's possible.
Okay, so to answer your question in short, the mechanism by which people comply is twofold: positive and negative enforcement mechanisms. The negative ones are sanctions, which make countries comply because they don't want to get hit with the sanction. And the positive one is we give countries money so they can have easier development to comply with their NDC. So when a country sets their own goal and then complies, they get the positive sanctions. When a country sets their own goal and doesn't comply with their own goal, they get hit with the negative sanction.
Right, and your argument is that we could add those, after the fact, and that's what you're defending, correct?
Exactly.
Yes.
Yeah, in short.
Next question. Mr. Houston.
I want to follow up with some of the same vein of questioning here and everything. I think addresses to the negative first. It seems to make a difference that you are talking about participation and compliance, and you use the whole, 200 countries are participating or whatever, and then only 50 of them are complying or whatever it is. And you even seem to say that the United States and China are the key to that, okay? How then, in your world, do you get a country or one of those 2 countries when it seems their government and their administration is not necessarily wishing to comply? How do you get them to comply? I mean, how do you get them to come to the party or help Will with his house,
Yeah, so again, let's make it extremely clear. If there is a country, let's say the Trump administration right now, who doesn't want to sign neither binding accords nor non-binding ones, then this administration simply goes far away from the debate because none of the sides can win this one. But what we are saying in the end is that in this instance, we basically can provide more of this kind of enforcement. That is to say, we have international pressure and we have a domestic one. And we think that these two are good because they still contain voluntary mechanisms rather than sanctions which infringe on sovereignty, which people care so much. So that is to say, one, we have the China polluter, but secondly, in the long run, and also especially in case of in previous administrations of United States, binding and non-binding agreements are better because in the end, people can actually go into them in the first place.
But earlier in the debate, you began to talk about, when you try to look at sovereignty and then the economy, right? You put those two side by side. Weren't you telling us, though, that the economy was much more important in people's mind than sovereignty?
No. Sorry. If there is a misconfusion, we were saying
Okay.
that we agree that climate change is extremely important aspect in academics in the real world. But what people care actually more, in general, is economy and two, compliance. They care about them because this is something which actually has a short-term effect on them because you literally either take away their rights or their money. And that is to say, an agreement which tackles climate change is a good one. But once they infringe on one of these two, is this the one which actually they will not prioritize? That is to say, this is the difference between the two worlds.
David, would you like to direct the same question to the affirmative or
Yeah,
a
I
similar
think,
one?
well, yeah, and I think the same vein and everything, I think one of the major points that you seem to be wanting to make is that, that for want of a better term, peer pressure, that you're going to create mechanisms that are going to cause countries to go ahead and comply with this. If again, the two major, people that are the two major countries that are the ones that don't comply are the United States and China. How do you get them to comply? What peers are going to pressure them to do that?
Okay, so a couple of things. First of all, we would contend, as I mentioned in my speech, that the one of the main reasons that the United States dropped out of Paris was a lack of parity. They felt that there weren't commitments across the board, so we think we would solve for that participation. But on the general compliance participation debate, what we would contend is that there's some scenarios where, say, take China for example, they might not ever want to submit to that level of sovereignty loss where they wouldn't have a BEM. We are saying that the level of compliance that they do right now, with Paris in place, all that peer pressure, all of that still exists in their world or in our world if they choose not to be a party to an accord. So really what this debate should come down to is their side is 195 countries and none of them do anything. Then our side is maybe 50, maybe 70 countries who all have high compliance rates. Then there are some countries outside of the agreement who will never do anything in either world because they'll take the hit no matter what. They're right, we can't solve that. But the third party are countries who they're not part of the agreement because of the sovereignty or economic hits or whatever, but they're still complying because they're complying right now. Essentially what we would say is compliance exists independent of both, or what we would say is countries who choose not to join in their arguments when they say that countries will drop out, those countries who drop out won't simply choose to start emitting a lot just out of spite. That's what we're saying.
Okay. Christina?
I have two separate questions. The first is for the affirmative. If their empirical evidence is indicative of what happens when binding enforcement mechanisms are added, which seems like a drop. They've given two examples of a drop in numbers. It also seems like participation is a prerequisite to compliance. So how would you be a step in the right direction if you actively undermine participation?
So to clarify again, as Otne explained in our second speech, both of the examples, the empirical examples they talked about, as they themselves stated uncontestedly, these are legally binding accords, not accords with binding enforcement mechanisms. These are two fundamentally different things. This is why they're not getting access to their impacts on participation, because legally binding accords happens when you sign onto the paper. Paris, for example, is legally binding. You are bound to do certain things. What a binding enforcement mechanism does is it punishes you 100% for sure if you don't do those things. Legally binding accords are their world. They exist in the negative status quo. binding enforcement mechanisms exist in our world. If anything, this turns their argument our way because they're saying in status quo agreements, which are legally binding, people aren't being compliant. People aren't participating. So, and secondarily, even if we don't want to buy any of that, even if we want to say participation goes down for sure, we would argue that participation without compliance is essentially meaningless. If you just sign onto an accord and you never take any action, you're not getting anything done. The time for words has passed. The time for deeds has begun. Even if we don't have a lot of countries participating, if some comply, we are moving in the right direction.
And you had a question to negative?
And a question for the negative. It seems like if we assume the affirmative's framing of the debate, which is magically BEMs are added to existing agreements, then it seems like if that would have been true and Obama would have signed something that was actually binding, then Trump would not have been able to get out. Why is that not an argument for the F?
Yeah, so thank you very much. There is a very clear response to that. There will never, ever be a Paris Agreement which is legally enforced signed by United States because Senate will simply not push it away, right? We believe that it will be, we agree, in an ideal world, it would be great if there would be binding agreements and everyone would sign to them and never leave. But that's not simply the case. Countries don't want to do that, and this is the reason why Paris Agreement wouldn't be possible to have the United States at the same time and on the other side having that. Moreover, maybe also to respond to what the affirmative says and maybe make it even more clear, we're not saying that all countries participating will do nothing. That's a complete lie. We're saying they will do sufficient amount of job, but comparatively, they will generally produce more outcome, that is to say C, rather than when you have completely zero, lower rate of participation.
Okay. So we all agree that the debate, the winner of the debate is the team that makes the best case for either BEMs increasing the likelihood of a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions versus essentially the status quo. Is that the debate?
Okay, so we have that component of the debate, but we uniquely as the affirmative read at the very bottom of our case that not only do we solve for greenhouse gas emissions, but we also solve for the fact that international law and the status quo, a lot of countries don't comply. But when we pass binding enforcement mechanisms, more countries will comply with other international law and other international treaties.
Okay, but just so we're clear, because at least theoretically, you want my ballot.
Yeah.
So
we'd like it in reality too.
You know, so
He's always in the minority.
well, now, David, how does he know that?
I didn't tell him. I'll throw Andrea under the bus.
All right, Andrew. No. So in the next speech, just so it's clear, I'm looking for evidence from either side that will indicate that adding binding enforcement mechanisms to greenhouse gas emission accords will actually achieve a more significant reduction than the status quo. Because I take it, and this is a question to the affirmative, you've agreed that adding BEMs will reduce participation. That's a yes or a no.
We're going to give you a maybe, even though you won't like that, because here's the argument we're going to make. We're going to say that there is a possibility.
Well, do you disagree with their evidence?
I mean, we disagree with the evidence they provided on participation decrease. Yes, we claim that it's, as they claim, legally binding,
what
not a binding
evidence
enforcement mechanism.
can you do it now or just put it in your next speech? What evidence do you have that adding BEMs to those types of accords will either not decrease participation or, perhaps stated differently, will actually achieve greater reductions?
For example, one accord with BEMs that did not have a large loss in participation, in fact, had pretty high participation, was the Montreal Accords, which in fact went on to achieve their goals of CFC elimination.
And the Montreal Accords had binding enforcement mechanisms.
Yes, they had both positive and negative mechanisms and did not see the loss in participation my opponents insinuate will happen.
Okay. Negative? What do you say about that?
So I would actually have 4 responses to this. Firstly, briefly about the
I'm gonna
Montreal.
get my pen out. All right, go ahead.
Firstly, about the Montreal Protocol. Well, firstly, this was not a climate change protocol. It regarded the ozone depletion, which is a different issue, and it is an issue which is much cheaper to solve. That was the reason for its success. Now, secondly, we agree with you that this debate is about reducing
So you
emissions.
say that experience in that accord is not relevant.
Yes, we say that
Okay.
it is not relevant for this debate.
All right, what else?
Secondly, we agree with you that this debate is about reducing emissions. However, we tell you that it is about reducing emissions in the real world, in the world we live in. It is not about this magic world where we can simply impose BMs onto a country. It is in this world where countries have to have to sign onto international legal obligations. Now, the third point is that they would give you these unique benefits of binding enforcement, which lie outside of climate change. Yet we tell you that this debate is fundamentally about climate change and about achieving it. Even if it wasn't, we still have unique benefits of media attention that we explained to you in our first speech. So this is not the point that should decide this debate. And fourth, just a brief clarification. It is not necessarily about altering the status quo, because in the status quo we already have binding and non-binding accords as well. We gave you the example of the Kyoto Protocol, which was a binding, which was a protocol with binding enforcement that regarded climate change, yet it failed. We compared this with Paris, which was a non-binding protocol that was far more successful. So it is about comparing these two types of accords going into the future.
So with permission?
Of course.
So first of all, I want to make it very, very clear that as the dean of Bill Brewer's law school, we're very, very proud of him. And as someone that's known him since he was your age and a debater, he hasn't lost it. So be careful. You may want his ballot because this may be the year he ends up in the majority. but whether or not you want my ballot, I don't know. But my formula has gotten more clear to me now, and I just want to give you an opportunity to respond to where I am now with regard to my ballot. So now for me, it's become about this. Neither of you have talked explicitly, but each of you has talked implicitly about a new noun I'm going to introduce, which is targets. So if I were to summarize your argument, I think that the negative claims, and here, by the way, I'm going to anticipate, because I have a PhD in religion, the secret argument you're going to bring up in a few minutes, okay? Which is that outside of this, there's going to be all this behavior that people are going to be, all kinds of norms that, on human rights, on a whole range of issues that have nothing to do with climate change, but just because people are going to see that the rule of law is good. Okay,
You
now,
have a
as the former
doctorate
dean,
in
as the
psychic
former
as well.
dean of a law school as well as a theologian, I'm going to tell you that sounds an awful lot like an argument lawyers would make. And there's this other argument over here by people that don't feel law is necessary to make the world work in a moral way, and that would say voluntary compliance is even better. And it's going to come down in this narrow proposition to the following. They say, now this is the word target, if you allow people to set their own voluntary targets, they're more likely to come to the table, and they're more likely to set high targets, and the aggregate result that Bill Brewer is going to get will be X. And they would say, by adding the necessity, whether you do it ex ante or ex post, okay, because that gets into a question of what countries can do in modifying treaties. But adding the BEMs, what you're going to do is you're going to have people set the bar lower, and even with the bar lower, you're going to have fewer people involved, and that formula is going to produce an aggregate that is some number less than X. Now, I think that's the way the debate crystallizes. You've got to prove that the targets are going to be high enough by the people that will come in. They've got to prove they're going to get higher targets and more people in to get the higher aggregate number. And then we're going to add whatever we want in this legal versus moral debate that you're going to create. And I'll just close by quoting Daniel Berrigan, who read to me once from a letter from Thomas Merton, in which Merton, a week before his death, said, "When the head of state presses the button that sends into the air the missile that destroys the world, it will be a legal act." So much for the relationship of morality and law.
Why don't you have the affirmative respond to that? I told you you'd never forget it. Let's give you a minute, and then the negative can follow that, and then we will, unless there's other questions, we will move to our final two rebuttal speeches, which are much anticipated, I think. So, affirmative for a minute.
So when you talk about the idea of setting our own targets and we talk about the NDCs that exist in both worlds, the affirmative is going to continue to make the argument that in the status quo, yes, we may have ambitious goals, but the key word is ambitious, because it's not just that they're not being reached, it's that people aren't even trying. This is a fundamental problem in the status quo, because we have reached a scenario in which everyone in this room, or probably everyone in this room, or at least the four of us up here, can agree that the climate accords that we have right now and the climate progress we're making right now is not good enough. That's why we're having this debate, because we are not making the progress that we need to have. So it doesn't matter how high their goals are, if they are not only not reaching for the bar, they are not even trying to reach for the bar. So we say if we lower the bar and that leads to them making an effort, that is net good, that is intrinsic good, and yeah, we're going to be making that rule of law argument at the end. So
Okay, affirmative? Yep. Negative, I apologize.
So I would like to start. Oh,
This is your 1 minute answer. This isn't the rebuttal speech.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yep. Okay. I would like to emphasize the evidence we provided even in the first speech, which was completely ignored. That is, as Fergus Green from the LSC says, quote, "Stronger bindingness in climate agreement has a strongly depressive effects on the ambition of key emitters," unquote. That is to say, in the affirmative world, you still have negotiations. Countries have power to decide what is good for them or not. When they are they're fearing that once they will simply not be able to do to fulfill the goals, they will generally sell the bar low. Now, affirmative still continues and explains how status quo is so bad, how we are all dying and stuff. But ladies and gentlemen, this debate is not about that we have to defend status quo. This debate is about choosing which agreement or which mechanism, which already exists in status quo because we already have binding and non-binding ones, which one we should prefer. And we are telling you that the one with higher goals, which is better, is better.
Anything else? Go right ahead.
For the affirmative, if a binding enforcement mechanism was triggered and punishment was meted out, what would stop the violators from simply dropping out of the process?
So we would say, and this is kind of anticipating like the Kyoto arguments that they're going to, I'm sure, make in their rebuttal or their final speech. We would say that, first of all, at the end of the day, we would contend that most countries wouldn't drop out if they failed to meet their targets, just because the cost of perceptually walking away from the table because you failed to meet your goal is a lot greater than whatever the cost of the compliance mechanism in the first place was. But second of all, and more importantly, we would say at the end of the day, if a country is willing to walk away from the table when they're not going to meet their agreements, there was no chance they would be an effective party in the first place. This goes back to what I was saying earlier. There's a middle ground of countries who we are helping, and all of the other countries, the countries who are going to comply anyways, and the countries who are definitely not going to comply anyways, those exist beyond both sides of this debate. It's about getting those people in the middle who are participating but not complying right now to comply, because we think we can get them to do so.
And for the negative, would you have the same argument against binding enforcement mechanisms if what was at stake was not punishment but incentives? If there were incentives in a treaty that rewarded compliance and that a failure to comply eliminated those incentives but did not include punishment, would your argument still stand?
We contend that our argument would stand just the same, because yes, these incentives would induce some countries to enter the agreement and to stay in it, but we must crucially recognize that these incentives have to be paid by someone. And this someone would be much less likely to enter an agreement where they have to pay a huge amount of money to other countries than a one where they don't. And yet, even if all of these were not true, we tell you that we can have these positive mechanisms on our side as well. Just as we had in the Paris Agreement with the Green Climate Fund. Yet on our side, it is voluntary, so it helps developing countries with the implementation costs, yet it does not deter participation of developed countries.